loosed the faithful lightning of his terrible swift sword. Here's to his marching on.
The story of the 54th Massachusetts Regiment is one that everyone should know. It's a story of bravery and determination of will in order to prove to those who doubted them that they were worthy of their honor and respect. In order to get a good understanding of the true events that took place, we'll be taking a look at the personal memoirs of Colonel Robert Shaw, who was the colonel of the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, and we'll also take a look into a letter written by one of the members of the regiment, and also some of the quotes of Frederick Douglass, who was a freed black man and a very prominent abolitionist in the Massachusetts area, which the regiment hailed from. This is the story of the 54th Massachusetts Regiment. The 54th Massachusetts Regiment was one of the most famous regiments of soldiers in the entire Civil War. Before then, black soldiers fighting for the Union were rare, and many of the white soldiers did not think them their equals on or off the battlefield. Most, if not all, black soldiers were given the menial and hard labor tasks and never saw time on the actual field of battle. After their famous actions at Fort Wagner, the 54th Massachusetts proved that African American men had a place in the ranks of the Union, and there was no denying that a black man could be just as good, if not better, than his white counterparts on the battlefield. After their legendary valor and courage spread throughout the Union, many black soldiers enlisted to fight. By the end of the war, over 179,000 black soldiers served in the Union Army, most of whom enlisted after the 54th Regiment had made their famous charge on Fort Wagner. Abraham Lincoln himself gave a large amount of credit to the black soldiers' involvement in the Civil War. He believed their added numbers at a key time in the war helped secure victory for the Union. The idea of black men fighting for the Union was not adopted at the start of the war. As it was, many people did not think the war would last very long. If the war was going to be over quick, why jump to enlisting black men and changing the scope of society by allowing them to do something they previously really weren't allowed to do? Even in the North, many people still had very real and strong racial prejudice towards African Americans. As the war pushed on, it became evident that there was a need for more soldiers. The war would not end as quickly as everyone had hoped. This brought about the rise of the discussion of forming regiments of black soldiers. Among the abolitionists lobbying for this idea, perhaps the most famous was Frederick Douglass. A former slave, Frederick Douglass had transformed himself into a leader in the community and a strong proponent for the rights and advancement of African American people in society. While the war effort may have been part of his reasoning for pushing for the formation of black regiments and the use of black soldiers, there was another strong reason he wanted to see this idea come to fruition, as made evident by this quote. "Once let the black man get upon his person the brass letter, U.S., let him get an eagle on his button, and a musket on his shoulder, and bullets in his pockets. There is no power on earth that can deny that he has earned the right to citizenship." Clearly, Douglass saw the beginning of using black soldiers as the beginning of the African Americans in the United States gaining some form of true respect and equal place in society. As the war moved on, with the help of voices like Douglass and the Massachusetts governor John A. Andrew, the 54th Massachusetts Colored Regiment would officially be formed. The call for black soldiers was put into effect. Many eager volunteers sprang to the call. In one of Colonel Shaw's letters, he mentions how well enlistment was going. From other recruiting offices we hear very good accounts, and the men seem to be enlisting quite fast. Most of the men that made up the ranks of the 54th were not former slaves, but rather they were free men in Massachusetts. They had jobs and families, which meant they had more than just their life to lose by fighting the war. The men who volunteered most likely shared the ideology of Frederick Douglass and saw this enlistment as a golden opportunity to prove to the country that African Americans were equal citizens. The first days of training camp was a very important time for the men of the 54th. There were many who doubted the abilities of black soldiers and did not think they would be able to learn the calls and commands necessary for soldiers of the Union to know in order to be effective in battle. This was the first stage of proving their worth. By all accounts, the men did just that. They learned with an eagerness that many said surpassed their white counterparts. By the time training was over and the men were ready to depart to their first assignment in South Carolina, they were a well-drilled and disciplined group of soldiers. When they marched through the streets of Boston, they were met with cheers from the crowd that had gathered in the streets to see them off. The 54th has been a success from beginning to end. The drill and discipline are all that anyone could expect. Crowds of people came to our battalion drills and dress parades every afternoon, and we have heard nothing but words of praise and astonishment from friend and foe, and I have not seen such enthusiasm since the first troops left for the war. They may have shown now that they could look like soldiers, but soon would come the time that the 54th had to show that they could also fight as soldiers. The fear of the 54th Regiment was not of battle, but rather that they would be used only as manual laborers and not soldiers. The men had signed up to fight, and they knew that if they were constantly assigned manual labor tasks, it was mainly because the officers in command of the regiment assignments did not trust their regiment to be capable in battle, or they were just doing it to spite them because they were black men. This was insulting to the men of the 54th, for they had trained hard to fight in battle. A very famous struggle that the 54th also faced in relation to blatant discrimination was the unequal pay. It was a demoralizing blow to the men when they were informed that instead of the promised $13 a month, they were only to receive $10 a month. Also, some months they had $3 of the $10 taken out as a part of payment for their uniforms and rations. This blatant devaluing of their lives hit hard with the men. However, they did something so honorable in return of this insult. It would eventually lead to an act in 1864 passed by Congress that guaranteed equal pay for black soldiers. The soldiers of the 54th refused to take any of their pay until they were able to receive equal pay. This act showed that the true passion and fierce demand for respect that the 54th wanted. Not only were the black soldiers fighting with less or no pay at all, they were also dealing with much crueler rules of engagement while in battle. The Confederates declared that all black men fighting for the Union were to be treated as rebel slaves, and black soldiers were frequently executed if they fell into Confederate hands. Even though the men insisted on trying their best to be soldiers with honor, the high commanding officers continued to devalue them and use them for menial tasks, and tasks that they did not subjugate white soldiers to do. When the 54th was given its first real assignment, the men were eager to finally do work other than manual labor. However, they would soon find that this was not the type of work they would want to be doing either. Colonel Montgomery, who was in command over Colonel Shaw, was putting together expedition parties in the area to look for supplies. This is how Shaw and his men made their way to the outskirts of the town of Darien, Georgia. This being their first mission, Shaw and his men were eager to embark. Shaw states in one of his letters, "On Wednesday, a steamboat appeared off our wharf, and Colonel Montgomery hailed me from the deck with, 'How soon can you get ready to start on an expedition?' I said, 'In half an hour.' And it was not long before we were on board with 8 companies, leaving 2 for camp guard." Shaw was an honorable man, and he liked for his officers and his soldiers to hold the same name of honor. So when Montgomery ordered the men to torch the town, Shaw complied, but met the command with resistance and complete disagreement with the command. He was not only worried about the honor of his name, but the honor of his black soldiers. Shaw had grown fond of the men after the time they had spent together, and he knew that a disgraceful act such as this could be enough to associate black soldiers with dirty and unsatisfactory action in the eyes of many northern people who were still looking for any excuse to discredit the men. Again, from his letters, Shaw writes a lengthy excerpt on this day. "And after the town was pretty thoroughly disemboweled, he," Colonel Montgomery, "said to me, 'I shall burn this town.' He speaks always in a very low tone, and has quite a sweet smile when addressing you. I told him, I do not want the responsibility of it. And he was only too happy to take it all on his shoulders, so the pretty little place was burnt to the ground, and not a shred remained standing. Montgomery firing the last buildings with his own hands. One of my companies assisted in it, because he ordered them out, and I had to obey. Now, dear Annie, remember not to breathe a word of what I have written about this raid to anyone out of our two families, for I have not yet made up my mind on what I ought to do. Besides my own distaste for this barbarous sort of warfare, I am not sure that it will not harm very much the reputation of black troops and of those connected with them. For myself, I have gone through the war so far without dishonor, and I do not like to degenerate into a plunderer and robber, and the same applies to every officer in my regiment. This passage from Shaw's letters clearly shows that Shaw did not want him or his men associated with any dishonor. Whether it was for his own reputation or the reputation of all of those under his command, Shaw wanted to do things the right way. This was very fortunate for all the black men of the 54th because they were able to prove themselves to the country while also gaining an honorable reputation. After the burning of Darien, the soldiers of the 54th got a chance to finally prove themselves in the way they had wanted to from the beginning of their enlistment. They were going to get a chance to fight in battle. This chance would come on July 16th, 1863, when the 54th was commanded to hold back an offensive maneuver conducted by the rebel forces, and the heroes of the day would be the 54th Massachusetts Regiment. The Confederate troops attempted to make their way up James Island and gain the superior positioning over the 10th Connecticut Regiment, who was at great risk if the Confederate forces managed to gain this positioning. However, the brave forces of the 54th stormed into battle and formed their lines in defense of the position. After 2 long hours of fighting, there was a clear victory for the Union, and the rebels withdrew from the area. The day of the skirmish was recounted by George E. Stevens, one of the men who fought for the 54th. The 10th Connecticut Regiment was encamped on our extreme left. Had our pickets retired precipitately, as pickets generally do, this regiment would have been captured. But they were enabled to take shelter under the gunboats. When our picket line reached the reserve, it had all skedaddled, and we were forced to withstand this attack of superior numbers until we reached the main body of our regiment, drawn up in the line of battle, supported by the 1st Connecticut Artillery. On the rebels came. Volley after volley was poured into them, and after a contest of 2 hours, they fled precipitately. This was the test that the 54th had so longed to pass, and they did so with flying colors. While not only saving another regiment from being captured, they managed to force back a group of rebel soldiers in their very first battle. The Confederates sustained heavy casualties, while the 54th only had 45 men either killed or wounded. Shaw wrote highly of the men's efforts as well, for he knew that the men were given the chance they deserved and had once again proven their worth and capability to their white counterparts. We have at last fought alongside of white troops. 200 of my men on picket this morning were attacked by 5 regiments of infantry, some cavalry, and a battery of artillery. The 10th Connecticut, of Stevens' brigade, were on their left, and say they should have had a bad time if the 54th men had not stood so well. The whole division was under arms in 15 minutes, and after coming up close in front of us, the enemy, finding us so strong, fell back. This victory for the 54th had to be short-lived, because just 2 days later, they would face the challenge that sent shockwaves around the nation. After the action the 54th saw on James Island, they wasted no time into getting their next assignment destination. In just 2 days, they had to make their way to Fort Wagner. General Gillmore had launched an assault of Morris Island, the island where Fort Wagner was, and was successful in driving back the Confederate forces there with the help of strong naval support. His plan was to take the fort and mount guns inside that would be able to eliminate the threat of the still Confederate Fort Sumter nearby. However, Gillmore did not capture the fort, and this created a major problem for the general. Morris Island is a thin and long strip of sand and marsh. There was little to no cover, and the fort was well built and heavily fortified. Nevertheless, there was an attempt to storm the fort on July 10th, 1863. This was a failed attempt, and General Gillmore had to regather himself and rethink his plan of attack. The new plan was to first bombard the fort with naval artillery for an extended period of time, in order to weaken the fort's main weaponry. Then, he was to send 5,000 infantry at the fort and take it by pure force of numbers. This strategy would prove devastating for whatever regiment was to lead the charge, and as it was to be, this regiment would be the 54th. The men of the 54th were weary from the 2-day journey from James Island to Morris Island, but somehow they found the strength to carry on. In a show of sheer will and heart, the 54th led a double-time charge straight into what was a barrage of gunfire from the Confederates. Colonel Shaw was with his men, on the ground, trying to inspire the valor they so desperately needed in order to face this grim task. As they got within a closer range of the fort, the Confederates opened fire. Many men fell in this battle, and especially a high percentage of the men in the 54th Regiment fell in this battle because they were leading. Colonel Robert Shaw was said to be yelling to his troops near the walls of the fort, "Come on, men," and as he went to charge on, he was shot and killed. Some of the soldiers made it through the fiery storm that was the Confederate gunfire and managed to get into the fort. However, there was little they could do, and eventually the Union troops had to call a retreat. George E. Stevens, who fought in the 54th and survived the battle, recounted some of the detail in one of his correspondences. About sundown, we were ordered to advance at the double quick-step, cheering as if going on some mirthful errand. The Rebs withheld their fire until we reached within 50 yards of the work, when jets of flame darted forth from every corner and embrasure, and even Fort Sumter poured solid shot and shell on our heads. The 54th, undaunted by this hellish storm, pushed up to the work, down into the moat, and like demons ascended from the parapet, found the interior lined with rebel soldiers who were well sheltered and fought them 1 hour before we were reinforced. Colonel Shaw is our noble and lamented commander, was the bravest of the brave. He did not take his 30 paces to the rear, but led the column up to the fort, and was the first man who stood on the parapet of the fort. When he reached it, he said, "Come on, men, follow me," and either received a mortal wound and fell over the wall, or stumbled into the fort and was killed. General Strong, seeing that the rebels were too great in force, ordered the retreat. When it was all said and done, the 54th had lost 281 men, which was by far the highest percentage of the regiment lost compared to any other on the beach that day. Though many died, including their fearless leader, Colonel Shaw, this was the event that truly and astoundingly proved the honor of the 54th Massachusetts Regiment. News would spread of the heroic men and their great bravery and skill in the battlefield. This would lead to the enlistment of many new black soldiers and help the Union secure victory in the war. The road of the 54th was filled with doubt, racism, and disapproval, and of any group of soldiers in the entire war, it seemed as though they had the most to prove. Through all the adversity they faced, with a great deal of pride and honor, they did in fact prove their worth.